say my name is Charlotte, but no one calls me that apart from my dad when he's angry, so it's Charlie. I think something that I was reflecting on yesterday when everyone was talking about different kind of ways of approaching agency is where my understanding of agency is grounded. And when I was thinking about this before I came to the conference, I very much felt like it was grounded in my background as a linguist and in my background as a literature teacher. And then I think I realised very much yesterday that another very important key part of it is that it's grounded in a kind of political concern, a kind of feminist action research concern. So I think those are the kind of three things that are going on at the same time, a kind of interest in language and linguistics, an interest in literature, and then this kind of feminist approach. This research I conducted in 2010, and it was a kind of exploration of a feminist pedagogy. But unlike some of the things that we've been talking about, the curriculum within which I was working was the Tanzanian curriculum. So it's a very constrained curriculum, very regular exams which a huge number of students fail, lots of people drop out of the system, and there are high levels of grade repetition. And the curriculum is very prescriptive. And with that kind of stereotype caricature of the kind of sub-Saharan African resource-poor school, the caricature was very much that the teacher stands at the front and talks and the students listen, the chalk and talk method is kind of dubbed. And I was interested to see how much space there was within that to get some feminism in there and see what happened, and to try and explore gender equality through the resources already available within this curriculum, and to explore kind of the ways in which gender norms were either solidified, shifted, renegotiated, what was going on around gender in the school context. So the school that I kind of did the research in is quite an unusual school. In one sense, it's extremely isolated. It was extremely rural. It was 45 minutes to the nearest village through the bush, and a further half an hour from the village to the nearest town, which was where the hospital, the market, that sort of stuff was. There was no electricity in the area, there was no internet, there was no water, that sort of thing. When it was rainy, which it very rarely was because it's part of this East Africa drought region that we get so much news about, but when it was rainy, it was, water up to your waist, impossible for food to get through, people carrying rice sacks on their heads and, boiling them on the top of their huts or whatever. So it was a kind of very isolated in terms of the rurality and in terms of how much interaction there was nationally. At the same time, though, it was an NGO school set up by an English woman from Oxford University, and I hope that's okay to say at Cambridge. But she married a Maasai man. And so their relationship I kind of see as a metaphor for the ethos and the values of the school. So it was about cultural exchange, and every year, regularly, volunteers go out to the school, and the idea is to exchange ideas and to learn from the two different cultures. So there's this kind of tension between the isolation in one sense and then the kind of global linking. And I was saying yesterday that one of the things I think that sums this up for me is that everyone still wears traditionally Maasai dress, beautiful, on BBC Two, the jumping, beautiful red kind of traditional clothes. They've got a mobile phone underneath. And I think that kind of summarises for me what's going on in terms of that community. The research was an ethnography, although I didn't realise at the time that that's what it was. But I used ethnographic methods. So as a teacher, as a researcher, I analysed the curriculum texts, I analysed the examinations, I observed other people teaching, I reflected on my own practice, I interviewed students, I analysed students' work, I tried to co-construct meaning around their work with the students by talking through the work that they'd done with them. I reflected both myself and with students on their presentations in the class, and then I conducted more formal focus groups and interviews. But I also lived at the school, so I wrote down lots of the kind of informal discussions that I was having with the teachers, which I think really informed my kind of understanding. So theoretically, obviously, I'm very grounded in feminism, but I think I'm also really interested in some of the different notions of power which relate to agency. And I find it quite interesting that power seems to have been a bit absent sometimes from our discussion over the course of this conference. And power for me is a really important component of agency. So I think this distinction that Raeln makes between power to do something and having the power within to do something is a really important one. And what she means by that is both there being a sense that you need to have the opportunity to do something, so there needs to be no external constraint to agency, but you also need to have the confidence to think that that's something that you can do. And those two kind of obviously are interrelated, but I think different. And I think for me, Naila Kabir summarises that really beautifully in the sense that she defines agency as both the ability to define one's goals and then to act upon them. And there's obviously a kind of interrelated but key distinction between those two. And it's this ability to define, to reflect, to think, to have consciousness about that I'm really interested in. The idea of what we have reason to value, why do we value the things that we do? And I think that's really important within the context of education, and that's what I'm going to try and explore with you with some of my data. Firstly, for anyone who speaks Swahili, I hope this doesn't look too weird to you. This is a focus group with there were 5 girls in the focus group, but just 2 of them are cited here. For those of you that do speak Swahili, their names mean 1 and 2. They're just anonymised by number as they came up in my research diary. So Morja is 1 and Mbili is 2. And I think this is really interesting because for me there's a question around, within education, are we looking at learning and agency, or are we looking at learning agency? Is learning agency something that you can learn? Can it be taught? Can it be fostered? Can it be developed? Or is it just something that kind of parallels to classroom practice? And this citation, if you look at the bottom, I hope, is it bold? Can you see it clearly? I don't know. Maybe turn off the light. Yes. Is that better? Yeah. I'm very grounded in data, so I've given you quite long extracts, but I hope you can just kind of read them and I'll pick out what for me are the salient features, but I wanted to give you the whole context. So we were kind of talking a lot in this focus group about the relationship between the classroom environment and then the village, the outside community, and people talked a lot about things in the class, things in the village, and that was a binary that was very commonly constructed by the students. And what I find really interesting is that the other binary that kind of parallels this classroom-village binary was the binary between the personal and the public spaces. The personal as political is a kind of very well-known mantra of feminists, and it was very clear from the discussion with the girls that this was very important to them. And so I was really interested in whether or not the kind of agency that you get through a classroom environment, particularly in a very good school that really fosters agency, can then be taken home, whether that, you travel with that through. And the 2 extracts that I've shown here suggest, the next one as well, suggest that they do. In this language of Mbili, I said, do you think later, once you talked about stuff, that it will be about things to do, gender, that it would be easier for you to discuss? And she says, yes, because we've already learned. And what I think she means there, and I explored it with her afterwards, is this combination between learning the ability to discuss, to negotiate, to have the power to speak, as well as learning facts, figures, whatever you need to learn to have the kind of information to support your own agentic decisions. So the kind of thing that I'll discuss with relation to the curriculum is there was lots of discussion while I was at the school around FGM, female genital mutilation, which I define as circumcision because that's how the students defined it. And there's a sense in which you both need to be able to talk about FGM because it's a taboo traditionally, and traditionally men wouldn't talk about FGM because it's a female sphere of influence. And you also need the information or the kind of knowledge resources to be able to explain why or why not you would or would not like to be circumcised. So there's a sense in which you need to be able to draw on that kind of health discourse as well as your own agency and your confidence to be able to talk about it. So Mbili says, yes, we've already learned, and I think she means something very rich there. When I was kind of questioning, though, what did she learn, it was this Swahili word at the top, which I will hopefully not too clumsily try to translate for you. And it was that word which is translated as confused in English, which for me is really imbued with a local meaning. And I think when we say confuse someone in English, it's quite devious, quite kind of tricky. If you confuse someone, you're in a position of power and you're kind of doing something a bit naughty. And I found it really difficult because every time someone kept describing me as confusing. Oh, you're a really confusing teacher. And I thought, oh God, like they don't understand what I'm talking about. This is dreadful. And then gradually it became clear that actually what they meant was something totally different. And for me, it's kind of crystallized around the Swahili rather than the English. So for those of you that are linguists, this verb is very strange because it's both passive and active. It's a passive verb which takes an object. Some of you are nodding and some of you are looking like I'm talking nonsense, but it means, so Watachanganiwa both means they are confusing someone else and they themselves are being confused. They're both actively and passively engaging in this process of confusion. And what's so interesting for me there is this verb itself, in its simple root, changa, which is the stem, means to mix up, but also to distill. It means two things at the same time. It means to twist up, and it's used for kind of stirring up in a big sufuria when you're cooking your chili or whatever. But it also means to kind of distill and make something pure, and all of those ingredients come together to make something different. And that, for me, was the localized understanding of agency. And that process of going through understanding that Swahili was really important for me. And I think for those of you, it sounds like lots of people aren't, but I think it really clarified for me the importance of localized understandings. And when we talk about agency, often we're talking about something which we all mean something different by. And even within schools in England, I think students understand we've seen in the previous presentation, students understand agency very differently to how teachers do. And there are all sorts of negotiations which take place. So I think understanding for me what someone means by the word agency was really important. So this verb confuse was how I kind of came to understand what agency was within this context. And it means a verbal dexterity, a power to speak, which is very important within a Maasai oral culture, and also some kind of discursive equality, some kind of ability to lock horns with someone, get in a debate and really feed off each other, mix yourselves up together and then come away as more successful than you were. So to go back to the kind of language of the theories, it was this, I think, that kind of really helped me to understand what we say when we have reason to value something. It's not just what you want, it's whether or not you can articulate it, whether or not you can work it out in the first place, and whether or not you are listened to when you do say what it is that you want. So with that kind of concept of agency in mind, which I hope is clear, I'm going to kind of talk about two aspects of the curriculum or of the research process which I think really speak to this notion of agency. Both of these come from teaching English, literature and language to Form 3 at the school that I was teaching at. And it comes from a theme on the curriculum itself, which was the theme of conflict. And through English, they explore the theme of conflict in lots of different ways. So they read a number of different texts. I'm only going to talk about one, but they read a number of different texts on the theme of conflict. And in their English language paper, they need to be able to write stories. And so I asked them, because of this theme, to write me a story about the theme of conflict. And because I'm not Maasai, and I was trying to position myself as someone who didn't know and who was trying to decenter her authority to some extent, as feminist pedagogy demands, I said, I don't know anything about your kind of culture. Tell me, what is it that you want me to know? And so these were the stories that came out of this. We're going to look, again, as a feminist, I apologise for focusing on girls, but we're going to look at two girls' stories. Mbili, you've seen in the previous extract, and Saba, the seventh girl who I came across, is the next story. Both of these girls, as the boys did, write about something which might be described as a constraint on agency. So this first story is about poverty, which is a very clear constraint on agency, and much discussed within the literature, both in terms of education and in terms of the broader society. What I think is really interesting, in this story she's talking about poverty, and the final sentence, no one wants to understand. She's talking about how people within the society negotiate and understand poverty, and through writing about it, she develops her own agency and her own understanding. The irony of writing no one understands is that she's trying to gain understanding by asking these questions. And I think for me this was a really important and valuable aspect of the curriculum, and a really salient lesson to learn as kind of teachers attempting to foster agency is the importance of asking questions. She asks her parents, to whom this is written, why are you making us like this? Why did you bring us into this world? But through answering that question, as she does in the story, she in fact is able to gain some kind of understanding. Saba's story is about a different constraint on agency, and it's about a gendered constraint on agency. The kind of constraints on agency of being a Maasai woman is what she's exploring, which is signalled very clearly in her first sentence about a kind of living in a Maasai tribe. And she moves, I think, really interestingly from the general, some families in Tanzania, to her family and to the particular. So she uses they a lot at the beginning, and then suddenly Saba's father enters the narrative. And within this story, which is still 1.5 years later, very upsetting and very difficult to read, thank you, she talks about lots of different constraints on agency through gender inequalities, such as polygamy, such as marital rape, such as the gender gap in economy, such as women not having proper access to health. But I think in exploring through this story all of those different interrelated gender inequities, she's able to gain an understanding of the kinds of things that as a woman she wants to change. And again, I think that that's invaluable. I probably don't have a huge amount of time to talk about this, but parallel to this kind of reflection on experience, which I asked the students to do through writing their own stories, was a text on the curriculum. And there are lots of them that do this, but I've just picked one because it related particularly to gender. And through exploring conflict on the curriculum, this book really allowed the students to, again, talk about their personal experiences and their personal agency, but this time perhaps even more freely, because they were using this character on the front, who's got her head resting on her chin. They used this character as a way of talking about their own experiences, but from a distant kind of psychological terms projected way. So Olabisi, this 14-year-old girl in this text, runs away from circumcision, which was the situation for many girls at the school. They were negotiating whether or not they were going to be circumcised with their parents. Some of them had left home and were now boarding at the school. Some of them had had huge arguments with their parents about whether or not they were going to have a forced marriage, which is kind of interrelated issue. And through this character, they were allowed to reflect on their own experiences without having to say what they personally themselves felt. And that is the second way, I think, in which experience can be really, really valuable. And the importance, therefore, of having something on the curriculum that seems relevant to the students, that they can relate to and engage with. And so I think that that's the really valuable lesson that I learnt from this, as well as the fact that in this text, they have 9 different characters, and each of the 9 different characters, from a different perspective, explores this issue of circumcision. And the value to that was that the students could position themselves and their viewpoints against these different characters. And so it wasn't alienating, like a curriculum that tells you don't do this or don't do that, which the civics curriculum does. But instead they could explore the different reasons why you may or may not want to do something. And just to conclude, the kind of value for me there is in this female student who takes some of that knowledge from this book and says, educated and informed children, which is the language of the text, should have the rights to choose. But she adds her own agentic perspective in order that we might build a future. And I think that kind of aspiration, that it's the rights to choose and the education and the information, that is how you build a future, was for me really positive. Thank you.